Hi, everyone. I'm Kevin Twohy. I am the founder and principal of Twohy Design Works, a small design practice for bringing new products to life through product and brand design. And for the past decade, I've been doing creative work in teams, ranging from tiny little startups all the way up to huge government agencies. And the best, most special creative work that I've done has been in small, tight-knit teams, say 3 to 7 people or so. And there's a special type of creative spark that comes out best in those types of groups, type of fluid, human-to-human creativity that can be challenging to get going when teams are just starting out and difficult to hold on to as teams grow really big. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. The magic of small group creativity and some tricks that I've found to harness that creative spark and bring it into places it doesn't typically go. So most of the great work that I have done has come from working creatively with other people and pushing directly against people, especially people who are not exactly like me, who have a different background, skill set. And for a big chunk of my career, I worked mostly alone, and I was sort of this lone wolf wandering the design landscape. And this was very convenient for me because it allowed me to avoid almost a decade of daily stand-up meetings. But this was a difficult lesson for me to learn. But I have come to believe that anything that kind of truly lasts and breaks through in design or in culture, that stuff happens when we come together and work on each other creatively. So small teams, 3 to 7 people or so, this is sort of the zone where that creative spark between people is the easiest to conjure. I'll talk about the exact ingredients for this type of creativity that I'm talking about, what's required. It's live, meaning it happens in the moment. It's urgent, meaning if you slow down too much, it stops working. It happens between humans. Essentially, it's difficult to do alone, and it doesn't really happen in Dex and Docs and Slack and things like that. It requires a common language between those people to work on each other, and I'll talk about that in a second. And lastly, it's serendipitous, by which I mean, unlike a lot of sort of structured creative processes where you go step A, B, C, and you kind of know what you're going to get on a specific time frame, in some cases, you just need to sort of get into position and wait to get lucky. And the reason I bring that up is that it can feel sometimes a little bit unsophisticated to do as compared with, the design sprint, for example. But it requires just a little bit of patience and a little bit of confidence to push through that. So some of you may have been lucky enough to experience this like in your work life and know what I'm talking about. If you don't, the best analogy that I can think of is that it's sort of like a band. You've got a group of people with different but complementary skill sets working together live, sort of waiting for that spark to happen. And humans are wired for this type of person-to-person human interaction. It's literally how our brains are formed to support that. So that's kind of the zone in the environment. Hopefully you get a picture for where that creative spark kind of wants to live most naturally. If you zoom out, this is sort of the landscape of doing creative working groups. On one end, you've got really tiny teams that are just getting going, struggling to find that spark, and on the other end, you've got like great big teams that may have had it in the past, but they're kind of struggling to keep it. So I'm going to talk about some things I've learned about how to create the conditions for that spark and bring it outwards into places it doesn't typically go. We'll start with really tiny teams, by which I mean maybe like 3 people or less. Sometimes this is startups just getting going. And you might think, well, shouldn't this be easier because there's fewer people around? And sometimes it is. But one of the real challenges in groups like this is that they tend to be really heterogeneous. You have different types of people, different types of skill sets. So they have different ways that they can actually contribute directly to the work. They have different mediums. I'll talk about that in a second. And then they just have different ways of communicating, different ways of expressing their creativity. So you may have someone who's a talker who thinks through talking. You may have someone who thinks through writing. You may have, there's probably a lot of visual communicators in the audience here. And that can just be really challenging because you can talk past each other and through each other and not work creatively together. So in these types of early stage teams, mixed heterogeneous groups, you've got lack of common language, lack of common medium. And I'll talk about each quickly. I'll tell you a story about each one. I'll start with language, and this story comes from one of my favorite projects I've ever worked on. Hopefully some of you in the audience have heard of Milk Bar. Anyone came in from New York? Shout out Milk Bar. So a few years back, I was doing some work with them, and again, small, mixed team, maybe 3 people or so. And one of the people I got to work with closely was Kevin Twohy. And if you know her, if you've seen her on TV, you know she's this bright, enthusiastic, warm person that just sort of like overflows with creativity, especially when she's talking about something she really cares about and is passionate about. So we're working on some design stuff together, and I was sort of doing what I thought you were supposed to do, which is I go design some stuff, I go to the client, they give me some comments, I change the designs, and then we sort of go in loops that way. And I think it's really underestimated how, when asking non-designers for design feedback, how unqualified and uncomfortable they can sometimes feel doing that, and unnatural. And sometimes this is fine, but it's a really horrible headspace to put someone in when you're trying to specifically pull their creative genius out to push on the work, which is exactly what I was trying to do in this case. As a side note, this is a phrase that, when you hear it, should stop you in your tracks. The person who says something like this is about to say something that they feel so strongly about, they're going to risk sounding dumb in front of the cool designers group. And when this happens, you have the hardest job in design, practice what I think is one of the hardest skills in design, which is to shut your own mouth and keep it shut and keep this person talking. Typically what comes after this is something really important or really surprising, and I can remember in my career like really specific examples of really important steers of the work that happened in moments like this, and they came from people who didn't know anything about design. So we're doing our feedback on designs thing, and Christina actually had quite good little design feedback. But the thing that I could not ignore that was sort of staring me in the face was that person who I described, who was so alive and expressive and sort of operating from her zone of creative genius, she was not really there in the room, wasn't available inside of Figma comments, and I knew at that time we needed to find a new way to communicate about the work, a new language to sort of figure out the creative center. So got rid of all the designs just to create some space, and we just started talking. And we talked for a long time. And as we would talk, I would start asking questions just out of curiosity. And when you're working with someone and talking about their most special thing, one of the most important things you can do is show a true and genuine curiosity about it, and that creates a trust that allows them to sort of expand out to meet you. So we're talking, and we're talking, and we're talking, and then there was one of those full silences. And then the silence broke, and she said, "How do we create something grown-up that celebrates the kid in all of us?" And I mean, I'm laughing because if you've been in these type of situations, you know this doesn't just happen. It doesn't just sort of come out. This is the type of thing that happens in like round 6 of the brand pyramid or something like that. It doesn't just happen in a moment, and that's what happened here. And I know it's corny, but I remember getting chills when it happened. I'm getting chills now even talking about it. It was such a special moment, and I know it's because we had the creative work there in the room, and we had the right language, and we had created those conditions, and that was the spark in this project. And it's the type of thing that can only happen when you allow people to express themselves in the way that feels natural and comfortable and proficient to them, not in the way that fits into your kind of like step 3 of your design process. So that was the spark in that project. After that, everything clicked, and we sort of had the wind at our back. So in terms of a common language, there's mediums that flatten people and mediums that allow them to expand into their zone of genius. And your job as a designer in these situations is to find the latter. So the other challenge I was going to talk about let me go back one second. The other challenge is lack of a common medium. What do I mean by that? The medium is essentially the work that you can do, the work product that you can do to steer the creative work. And within design and technology companies, there's kind of like a really narrow set of mediums that are accepted to push and steer the creative work. These are sort of the accepted types of creativity within design and technology companies, and if this slide describes you, that's fantastic, but what about the other 95% of people on planet Earth who have something to say and something to contribute to that creative spark? We've got to create a way in for those people as well. Typically, the way that this is done, or at least the way that I've seen in design cultures and design companies, is we try to kind of like pull people into our world with our kind of idioms and syntax. And sometimes this can work decently, but again, I think it's really underestimated how uncomfortable it feels to be asked to be creative while doing something you don't feel you're any good at. Most people don't draw in their daily lives, and they definitely don't come up with digital product design ideas through sketching in their daily lives, even if you make it cute, like you do in this exercise. So people are thinking in the back of their mind, their voice is saying, I'm really not very good at this. So what can you do instead? We can come up with a medium that they can work in, doing something they already know how to do, that they feel they're good at, and use that medium to tell us what they know. So a few years back, I was working with the New York Times, and I know the New York Times, you might be thinking, oh, isn't that a big company, and we're talking about small teams. This was one of those small, mixed groups, a group of designers working mostly with editors who do editorial curation and programming, and working with business people, doing whatever it is business people do. And we were working on how audio and narrated journalism could fit into their suite of products, essentially creating an audio front page for the Times. And being a front page, it needs to be responsive to sort of the changing shape of the news across the day and across the week. So we're working with editors to figure this out, and we could have designed some things and asked them for design feedback on what we had made, or we could have asked them to draw some little things out and draw how they think it should work. Instead, what we tried to do is, again, create a medium where they can do something they're absolute experts at, editorial curation and programming, tell us what they know, and bring that into the work. So we asked them to actually program a real day's worth of news through audio, not through drawing, but through story selection, curation, and programming. And they did it for that real day of news. So unlike a brainstorm, it wasn't something like hypothetical or imagined. It was very real and urgent to that day. And we did this a lot. We did it over and over and over again until we started to get a sense of how the design might meet sort of the shape of the content. And then we played that back to them in a loop over and over and over again. And you'll notice in this process, even then, we didn't really go asking editors to give design feedback on interface designs. By the time they saw anything visual, their expertise and their idea and their point of view, it's already there in the work. So in small, mixed groups, you're trying to first figure out who you're talking to, and then create the way to communicate that makes them expand, and create a medium for them to contribute where they feel natural, fluid, and proficient, and steer the work from there. So that's a couple examples of small teams, really tiny teams. I'm going to talk a bit about big groups now, which for most people here probably means big companies. And I think it's easy to say, well, companies just get big and then things sort of slow down, and that's kind of the way it is. But why does this actually happen? What is the specific reason? And there's two really common reasons that I see. The first one is about coordination. So there's a lot of people just by the nature, and they're sort of out there running amok, and they need to be coordinated, and someone needs to create a process to keep all these people in line. And you need to write the process down, and then you need to split the people into groups to follow the process. And some of this is just sort of necessary, but one of the things that I observe happens is as the process runs, people just naturally sort of start to wait for their turn in the process to do their creative piece. Then they pass it to the next person in the process. So I call this turn-based creativity. And it leads to this loss of urgency and pressure, which you'll remember, that's kind of like one of the key ingredients of that fluid human-to-human creativity. There's a loss of pressure. The second one is just sort of about orgs. And when companies get large enough, they start walking like an org and talking like an org and doing orgish things. And that tends to have this flattening effect, and you have the loss of the individual. So you lose a lot of that texture and individual point of view that you brought the person in for in the first place. And so I'll tell a couple really specific tactics of trying to push through these two specific problems. And the first one I'll share is about the loss of the individual. It's about meetings. So I know everyone loves meetings, but in big companies, when meetings exceed a certain size, they sort of like subtly stop being a conversation and they start being something else, right? It can take many forms, but typically it's like, you wait your turn to talk and then you can kind of +1 things here and there. And that's sort of the form that they take, and in some cases there's nothing wrong with that, but it's really this flattening of the individual. You don't hear a lot of I statements. It's hard to kind of like break in and even get your voice heard. So they're fundamentally consensus seeking and they flatten the individual. So how do you bring the individual back out in these large sort of group meetings? So this is a tactic I learned from one of my clients, and it might sound a little silly and you might feel a little silly when you propose it, but I promise it's so effective. And the way it works is this. At the end of one of these big meetings, you have everyone in the meeting go into the chat and type but not send the thing that is the loudest in their mind at that moment. Their kind of like most salient idea, impression, point of view, emotion, just what's in their mind at that moment. Everyone writes it, you wait, and then everyone hits send all at once. And what you get is, instead of this sort of like flattening consensus that's just in the mind of the meeting owner, is a couple dozen individual, personal points of view. And it sort of shocks people back into their individual personhood. And I see people literally wake up from the end of the meeting when they're asked to do this. And it's amazing how often what we thought the takeaway from the meeting was does not show up here at all. How often there was a hidden consensus amongst the group that never got spoken. And how often one of these things, within one of these things, is the exact spark that you need to push the work. So that's just a very specific tactic I've learned and is really effective in large groups. I encourage you to try it. I'll share one more tactic with you, and this one is about the speed and urgency. So again, in these large groups, things sort of tend to slow down and move at the speed of the org, not at sort of like human creative speed. And some of that is necessary, but every once in a while it can be really, really useful to do what I call punch the throttle and push forward really fast in time scale and sort of jump into the future. What am I talking about? So for almost any question, I believe there exists a design answer that can be articulated at any of these time scales. So what you're going to do is take whatever big initiative or question is kind of like looming over the org. It's being talked about a lot. It's being talked about in the present tense. It's summoning documents and such. And you're going to get a few people in a room, and we're going to create an answer to this in 1 hour. And you're going to create the whole thing. You're not going to leave anything out. You're not going to leave anything to a meeting that's next week or like a sync later. It all has to happen in that room. And that's what creates that urgency and pressure for that creative spark. And what you will create is just an answer. It's typically not the right answer, but it exists, and it acts as a lightning rod within both the team, the company, but also all of the people that can be pushed against, and other people's creativity can work on that answer that you've created. So how do you know when it might be time to punch the throttle? I think in general, in design and technology companies, anytime you hear time referred to with a Q in it is a good signal that it might be really useful to sort of punch the throttle and push forward and create something clarifying. How is it actually done? The way I typically do this with my clients is in intensive, live, 90-minute design sessions. There's 4 people, myself, the client, and then 2 supporting designers, 1 product designer, 1 brand designer. And we do a lot of prep up front. Everyone gets very prepared, and we know exactly what we're talking about, which speaks to common language. And then when we get into the meeting, it's very unstructured, very fluid. We just start having a conversation. And as we have a conversation, we start doing some designs in response to what we're saying, and then the conversation starts to flow from the design work, and we go in loops that way, sort of trying to chase that spark. And again, that speaks to this factor of it feeling a little bit unsophisticated. You might be worrying, like, what is the client thinking? What are we doing here? But it's such an effective way to have the conversation and the thoughts and the ideas of the team be visualized right there in the moment. The reason I have 2 other designers with me for these exercises is that that's what I've found is needed to have the bandwidth of a live human conversation match the bandwidth of the design output, and it's so critical and essential to have those 2 things be synchronous and acting on each other in the meeting, not just a week later you come back with a sketch. So that's a tactic you can try. It's really amazing what you can produce in a session like this, and it's even more amazing how doing this even a couple times creates this kind of creative muscle memory for speed within the team. People remember what it felt like to zoom forward and create something clarifying in an hour, and they know when to sort of reach for that throttle and do it as a matter of practice. So there's a couple ways to bring individuality, pressure, and speed back to large group contexts. And just wrapping up, that is sort of at the core of what I've learned about how to be at our best creatively together. And I thank you for coming, and I wish you the best of luck.